"Old man, move it. This seat's for men who still serve." The young commando barked, his boots clanking against the cafe tile as he shoved past the gray-haired stranger sipping black coffee alone. The old man didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, just quietly placed his mug down and shifted to the edge of the bench with steady hands. The commando scoffed, flexing his shoulders while his buddies laughed nearby. "Bet you never wore a uniform in your life." The cafe went quiet, but the veteran said nothing, only adjusted the worn patch stitched to his coat sleeve, one with faded lettering too old to recognize. Minutes passed. A new vehicle pulled up outside. Matte black, low profile, government plates. The cafe door swung open fast. In walked a tall figure in plain green fatigues. He scanned the room once, then locked eyes on the old man, and saluted. He arrived, like he always did. Quiet, deliberate, early. The memorial gates weren't open yet, but that didn't stop him. With his hands tucked into his old military coat, the man stood still, like he had all the time in the world. No one noticed him at first. The wind picked up just slightly, rustling the edge of the flag above. He didn't flinch. His eyes stayed on the gate, unmoving. To most, he looked like a statue placed wrong, but to the few who passed and looked closely, there was something familiar about his stance. He had a certain presence, one that couldn't be faked. The way his feet were planted, shoulder-width apart, the way his spine never bent, not even when the chill bit harder. All of it told a story louder than words ever could. One by one, people started lining up behind him. Most didn't speak. The memorial drew a particular kind of crowd, those who understood reverence, silence, and sacrifice. Still, a few whispered to each other, curious about the man who hadn't moved an inch. A security guard walked up from the side, clipboard in hand. He squinted at the man, flipped a few pages, and said without warmth, "You're not on the list." The veteran didn't blink, just shifted his weight slightly to the left. Named a guard asked again, more firm this time. The old man's reply was soft but direct. "Look again." There was no arrogance in his voice, just certainty. The kind that made people pause even when they didn't want to. The guard frowned and scanned again. Behind them, the line grew. A few men started to recognize the shape of the man's shoulders. One whispered to another, "Is that?" The other didn't reply, just nodded slowly. Eyes locked on the back of that weathered coat and the patch that was barely holding on. The patch was old, faded to the point that only those who'd served in certain places during certain years could understand it. A bent eagle claw, stitched with thread that had been repaired more than once. A relic from a forgotten deployment. Another guard approached from the inside, watching the exchange. He leaned to his colleague and muttered, "He's not cleared. If he's not on the guest list, he doesn't go in." But even as he said it, his eyes lingered on the man longer than they should have. The veteran reached into his coat, slow and careful, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to the first guard. No words, just a steady gaze. The guard unfolded it. An old commendation letter, edges frayed, ink faded, but the signature unmistakable. His hands trembled slightly as he read the name at the bottom. The former governor. The guard swallowed hard. "This doesn't mean anything," he said, voice unsure. The old man raised an eyebrow. Not in anger, in disappointment, like hearing a lie told to a child. Behind him, a younger officer stepped out from the line. Not a security guard, a visiting veteran in dress blues. He walked up slowly and stopped beside the old man. He didn't say a word, just gave a nod. The kind of nod you only give when you know exactly who someone is. The security guards looked at each other. An ease crept in. Something wasn't adding up, and yet, the clipboard still didn't show his name. "He's not authorized," one said again, but softer this time, almost like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. A black car pulled up outside the gate. Not flashy, just functional, but it had the plates. Government plates. The doors didn't open right away. The engine stayed running. Inside, someone waited, watching, timing the moment just right. The guard looked back at the veteran, who hadn't moved a muscle. "You can't wait here?" he said finally. The veteran didn't argue. He just stepped one foot to the side, barely clearing the path, but not leaving. Not yet. Not until the gate opened. Every morning was like this. For the last 3 weeks, he arrived early, waited, got turned away, and never once raised his voice. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about being seen, being remembered, not for fame, but for duty fulfilled. Some days, people asked him why he kept showing up. "They'll never let you in," one man had said. The veteran only replied, "They already did. Once." That was all. No explanation, just enough to keep the question hanging heavy in the air. Word had started to spread. Quietly, among certain circles, someone important was being left out, whether by oversight or design. No one knew. But the whispers grew louder each day. Someone had forgotten to check a record, or someone had erased it. That morning, a man inside the memorial's main office took a call. A deep voice on the other end said, "Check the list again." The staffer hesitated. Sir, I've checked it 5 times, but the voice interrupted. Then check your records, because you missed someone. Back outside, the gate remained closed, but the tension had changed. The guards weren't sure what to do. Deny entry again, or wait for a call they weren't supposed to expect. The veteran didn't speak. He just waited. .com. Like always, the crowd behind him shifted. More people arriving, and this time, when they saw him, they didn't just line up behind. They nodded. They stepped slightly to the side. They gave him space. Not because of rules, but because of respect. The sun climbed higher. The flag cast a long shadow across the pavement. The wind caught the edge of the old man's collar and lifted it slightly. Like something unseen was trying to straighten his posture even more, like the past itself had his back. Then, a voice crackled through a guard's radio. 3 words. He's on it. No explanation, no apology, just instruction. The guard stiffened, looked up, met the old man's eyes, and nodded. Gates open, sir. The veteran stepped forward, slow, steady, and with quiet grace. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. The walk alone said everything. Behind him, the crowd watched in silence. No one dared follow. Not yet. This moment was his. One of the guards saluted, unsure why. It just felt right. Another followed, and then another, like muscle memory from boot camp kicked in. Only now, it was being aimed at someone who hadn't commanded them, but who had once been just like them. As the veteran walked through the gate, a figure stepped out of the black car. Tall, clean-cut, wearing a dark blazer with a pin that meant power. It was the governor, the current one. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, he just watched. And then, right before the old man reached the steps of the memorial, the governor called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Welcome back, Sergeant. The words hit like thunder. Not because of the volume, but because of the weight they carried. The crowd stood still. The guards stepped back. And the veteran paused just once, turned his head slightly, and nodded. Not just to the governor, but to the names on the wall in front of him. To the brothers who couldn't walk through with him. He climbed the steps one at a time. Each footfall like a heartbeat. Each moment a memory. He had come not for recognition, but for remembrance. And now, he had both. Not from headlines, not from strangers, but from those who still remembered what it meant to serve. And when he reached the top, he didn't cry, he didn't speak, he simply stood still, the quiet center of a world that had almost forgotten him. He never said his full name out loud anymore, not because he'd forgotten it, but because he didn't need to. The right people already knew, and the wrong ones never mattered. Inside the memorial offices, a junior clerk flipped through printed names. His fingers moved fast, but his eyes kept pausing. Almost like something was off, but he couldn't explain what. Every name in that binder carried a life, a record, a flag, but not his. Not yet. His name was always missing. Not due to error, but by someone's intention. The problem wasn't the man outside. The problem was the paperwork inside. And deep down, everyone working that desk knew they were sitting on a mistake bigger than any signature could fix. 3 weeks back, a phone call was received in confidence. It warned, he'll come. You won't find him on any digital list, but when he does, you stand down. That call was brushed off like static on an old radio. Ignored, misfiled, disbelieved. But now the man from that call stood outside the gate, and the cold truth had caught up. You see, decades ago, this man had served under classified missions. No photos, no medals, no press, just ink on paper, locked behind clearance higher than most guards could imagine. In the Pentagon files, his name still triggered red lights. His operations weren't just covert. They were erased, for everyone's protection, especially but someone had removed too much. The problem with removing history is that it doesn't stay gone, especially when the man carrying it refuses to fade. That's the thing about ghosts. The real ones don't rattle chains. They walk quiet. Inside the record room, an older archivist narrowed his eyes. He'd heard the rumors. He'd seen that name once, long ago, a field report that vanished 2 days later. He leaned back in his chair and whispered to no one. He shouldn't exist. Then stared at the security camera feed showing that lone figure waiting in the cold morning air. Another staffer approached and asked if the line outside should be addressed. The archivist replied, "No rush. That man's not going anywhere. He's waited longer than you've been alive." Meanwhile, a phone inside the state governor's office buzzed once. Then again, the aide picked up casually, but his posture straightened mid-sentence. Someone had said the old man's name. The governor looked up from his desk. He didn't ask questions, just nodded slowly. Then said, "Bring me the list." The real one. His voice wasn't angry. It was precise. There's a tone people carry when they've worn the same boots. The governor had once stood in foxholes too. Different wars, same code. And that code didn't tolerate forgetting your own. Back at the memorial, the guards kept glancing between the clipboard and the man. The silence was louder than anything. Every breath felt like a countdown they hadn't trained for. One young officer, barely 30, finally stepped forward. He didn't ask permission. He just walked beside the old man and stood with him. No words, just presence, like saying, "You're not alone." The guard's radio cracked to life again. A senior voice now. "He's confirmed. You delay him again? It's on you." The words struck harder than they should have, because this wasn't protocol anymore. Inside the hall, someone retrieved a folder locked behind an old steel drawer. The file was thin, not because it lacked details, but because the contents weren't meant to exist. Handwritten? Classified? Some lines redacted, others faded. One paper clipped inside carried a photo. Grainy, black and white, showing a much younger version of the man waiting outside. A note scribbled in pen said, "Status, living archive, clearance level, governor only," and below it, a signature. The same man who now sat behind the state seal. Older, wiser, quiet. The governor folded the folder and tucked it under his arm. No escort, no announcement. He headed for the exit like a man answering a personal call, not a political one. The drive to the memorial was silent. No press, no motorcade. Just tinted windows and a heavy file, and the weight of knowing that some debts aren't settled on paper. When the car pulled in, no one clapped. No cameras clicked. Just a handful of guards stood frozen. They recognized the license plate. They understood what that meant without being told. The governor stepped out, held the file close, and approached the gate. His eyes scanned the veteran. There was no surprise, just recognition, and a hint of something deeper. Respect? He didn't speak immediately. Neither did the old man. They just stood there, two different generations in the same uniform. One still in office, the other long retired but never replaced. Finally, the governor said, "You're not forgotten." The veteran gave a slow nod, as if to say, "I never needed to be remembered, just seen." The wind carried that silence like scripture. One of the guards stepped forward nervously. "Should I check him in?" The governor shook his head. "He was checked in years ago. You just didn't see it." That moment shifted everything. The veteran walked forward, past the gates that had blocked him for weeks. No resistance this time. No clipboard. Just open silence, an open path. But the story didn't stop there, because inside that memorial, carved into stone, were names he hadn't seen in years. Names of men he'd bled with. Names only he could pronounce right. He paused at one, ran his fingers across the etched surface, whispered a name so softly it almost sounded like wind. But his eyes told the full story. They never forgot. A young recruit nearby asked, "Who is he?" Another replied, "Someone whose story they erased." A third added, "But he just rewrote it by showing up when no one expected." At that moment, the governor turned and walked back toward his car. He didn't wait for applause, didn't explain himself. He'd done what needed to be done. And now, the rest was up to memory. And for the veteran, he never spoke of that morning again. He didn't need to, because from that day forward, no one stopped him at any gate. No one dared. Respect isn't always about titles. Sometimes it's about how long you're willing to stand when the world tells you to move. And he stood longer than most men could even dream. The wind had picked up by mid-morning, cold and sharp, brushing against the brass plaques that lined the outer wall. The veteran walked slowly, each step measured and controlled. He passed row after row of engraved names, his boots making the only sound across the polished granite floor. The echoes didn't bother him. They sounded like old memories. A younger soldier followed at a respectful distance, unsure if he should ask questions or just observe. Something about the way the old man carried himself made silence feel appropriate. His back wasn't hunched, but firm, like someone who'd never stopped standing at attention. The insignia on his jacket sleeve had begun to fray again, just slightly. He paused by a column that had no names, just blank space. Waiting, his hand hovered over it but didn't touch, as if doing so would disturb the silence. Behind him, a retired captain muttered to another, "That's where his unit should have been." The other nodded quietly, eyes fixed forward, not daring to interrupt what was unfolding. Years ago, his team had been wiped from records, not because they failed, but because they succeeded where they shouldn't have. Operations never meant for headlines, medals, or handshakes. He remembered one night in the jungle. Soaked boots, faulty comms, radio silence. He'd carried 2 wounded out on his own, one bullet still lodged in his side. The only witness was the dark. And yet, here he stood, decades later, still carrying that silence like a medal no one else could see. Not many knew the weight. At one point, a junior officer stepped closer. "Sir, were you with?" But the veteran cut a glance that halted the question mid. Some answers are earned, not given. The governor remained inside the visitor center, watching through the glass. He wasn't here to take credit or offer thanks. This wasn't politics, it was personal. Soldier to soldier. He'd once heard about the living ghost, a man who had never retired, who never officially existed, but who'd shaped missions from the shadows. The file had confirmed it. Now that man walked alone again, not out of pride, but purpose. This wasn't a victory lap, it was remembrance. Each plaque held a friend. Each corner, a shadow of someone. He reached the far end of the corridor, where a private alcove stood, almost hidden. No names, no flags, just a single bench and a view of the national seal. He sat slowly, not like an old man, but like someone returning to a place he helped build. And for a moment, his shoulders relaxed just slightly. A whisper came from behind. "You built that wing, didn't you?" A sergeant had wandered close. The veteran didn't answer, but the way he tilted his head made the reply obvious. His contribution wasn't funded. It wasn't signed, but it existed in stone. Approved under quiet orders, passed down by names no longer active. That bench had been placed for him. While cameras never recorded his war stories, brick and steel did, and the structure itself seemed to hold its breath around him, aware of the man it had quietly waited for. He removed a folded photo from his inner pocket. 4 men stood in it. Blurry, young, unsmiling. The image had faded, but their eyes hadn't. Neither had the promise made. They'd all sworn to meet again someday. If not in person, then in memory. Today, he'd kept that promise alone. But that didn't mean they were absent. Not here. A black van rolled past the entrance. Not official, but recognizable. Inside were 2 retired generals, unannounced, observing from behind tinted windows. They didn't enter. They didn't need to. Both men had once served above him. Technically, but not morally. They understood he'd saved more lives than some battalions. That saluting him was instinct, not formality. Security stayed quiet now, radios off, no clipboard checks. Even the janitor paused, watching from a distance, realizing this was one of those rare days when walls remembered. Every movement the veteran made felt deliberate, like muscle memory from another life. He stood again, readjusted his collar, and looked once more toward the marble center hall. Etched at the center of that hall was a line. To those who served without glory. He stepped to it, paused, then tapped it lightly with 2 fingers. Once it was his line, he'd written it once, in a field memo after a botched mission with 0 survivors except him. Someone had picked it up years later and engraved it. He didn't smile, didn't cry, just stood still, like a statue with breath. And those watching finally realized. This wasn't just any veteran. This was the one they whispered about. In quiet corners, over closed doors, in coded dispatches, he wasn't the story you tell at the bar. He was the reason the bar even existed in peace. After a few minutes, he turned and began walking back toward the main gate. The long hallway felt shorter now, though no one had moved. Everyone gave him room. One soldier even came to attention, not out of show, but because something inside told him it was right. He didn't know the man, but he knew the weight. A final step took him outside. Again, the sun had shifted, casting longer shadows. The same breeze returned, brushing his jacket sleeve just enough to reveal the faded patch. This time, no one looked away. Even the guard from earlier stood straighter, not in apology, but in honor. He understood now, not through explanation, through presence. Respect doesn't always require words. Sometimes it's just knowing when to stand down. And every man at that gate stood down that day. Without being told, the veteran adjusted his watch, checked the second hand, then moved forward. Not rushed, not delayed, just right on time, as if the entire world had been waiting. By the time the veteran reached the parking lot, a quiet stillness had blanketed the memorial like early fog. No cars moved, no idle chatter, just reverence you could feel. He paused at the edge of the walkway. The flagpole in front of him swayed gently, casting a shadow that split right across the granite path he'd helped lay years ago. The security guard who'd refused him earlier stood awkwardly to the side, hat in hand now, unsure how to correct a mistake that had been deeper than policy. He opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it. The veteran didn't even glance his way, not out of disrespect, but because the moment no longer belonged to him. A black SUV pulled up silently. No sirens, no engine growl, just a whisper of movement, like the world holding its breath. And from it stepped the governor, Nuentoraji. He wore no suit, no tie, just a simple jacket, the same type issued to field officers decades ago. It wasn't for show. It was a uniform of shared memory. The veteran turned as the governor approached, and for a second, neither moved. No handshake, no greeting, just 2 men from different wars, recognizing something only warriors understand. Then, the governor raised his hand and delivered a crisp salute. One sharp, unwavering motion, the kind that comes from deep respect, not protocol. The air around them thickened. Everyone nearby froze. Even the birds seemed to quiet. You could hear the flapping of a flag, the crunch of gravel beneath a shifting boot, and nothing else. And then, the veteran returned the salute. Slower, but stronger, as if decades had just rewound in his bones, bringing back every drill, every order, every sacrifice. The governor spoke first. "Permission to walk with you, Sergeant." The veteran nodded once, a small gesture, but enough to crack the tension that had settled across the grounds. They walked side by side, no security, no cameras, Just two men tracing a path only a few had ever earned the right to walk. Toward the national pillar, there, etched in quiet letters, was the name the world had never known. Because it had been hidden, for safety, for secrecy, but not anymore. Today, it stood uncovered. Not for politics, not for parade, but for truth. The governor reached forward and ran his fingers across the engraving. "Took long enough," he muttered, with a tired smile. The veteran didn't smile back, but his eyes softened. He wasn't here for thanks, he was here for closure, for those who didn't get to walk away like he had. And standing in that silence, both men seemed smaller than the wall behind them, as if history itself loomed quietly, watching over its own. A news drone hovered far away, out of sight, capturing just enough for a headline. But not the heart. The heart of it was in the silence, in what wasn't said, because moments like these don't speak loudly. They echo in the pauses, in the firm nod of a leader, in the way a soldier carries his past without asking anyone to hold it. The governor stepped back as the veteran approached the final panel, the one kept blank all these years. Slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded slip. A name was written there, in firm, neat print, not his, but a friend's, one of the men who hadn't made it out. One of the reasons he still walked alone. He pressed the slip beneath the glass. A temporary act, but one that made the panel complete. For now, for those watching, and for himself. Just for a moment. Behind them, footsteps grew louder, but no one dared interrupt. Not when history was being honored, not just remembered, and certainly not when a man like that stood present. He turned back toward the open plaza, the crowd still watching. They didn't cheer, they didn't clap, they just stood, taller. Somehow, like being near him demanded it. And the security guard who'd started this all? He saluted this time. No hesitation, no embarrassment, just a man admitting he'd been wrong the only way that mattered. The veteran didn't acknowledge it directly, but the faintest dip of his head said enough. Then he began the long walk back toward the world that hadn't deserved him, a world he protected anyway, silently, relentlessly. Because that's what soldiers do. They don't wait for applause, they just make sure others get to keep living loudly. The governor remained at the wall, staring after him. "That's what real service looks like," he whispered, mostly to himself. And a nearby staffer couldn't help but nod, because today, a ghost had walked among them, not to haunt, but to remind that sometimes heroes wear no medals. They just carry the weight for all of us. As the veteran reached the edge of the parking lot, a black car idled nearby. The door opened, not by a driver, but by a fellow soldier. Retired, silent, waiting. No words exchanged, just recognition. He stepped in, closed the door, and the vehicle pulled away. Quietly, like it knew noise didn't belong to men like that. And back at the memorial, the wind picked up again. Flags fluttered harder, not just in the breeze, but like they were saluting, too. Like the building itself had one visitor said later, "I didn't even know his name, but I knew I was in the presence of something holy." And maybe that's the way it should be. Not all stories end with medals. Some end with a walk, a handshake, a silent bench, and a name whispered by governors who understand what the rest of us forgot. That real power isn't loud. It's humble. It's earned. And once in a while, it walks right past you, quietly. It makes history feel personal again.